there is a flower buried with a Neanderthal, not placed accidentally, not fallen from a tree above the grave, deliberately gathered, deliberately arranged, deliberately laid beside a body that someone could not bring themselves to simply leave behind. The grave is 60,000 years old. It was found in a cave in northern Iraq. And for decades, the flower pollen found in and around it was the single most debated piece of evidence in all of human prehistory, not because of what it told us about burial practices, but because of what it implied about the mind that had performed them. Because to bury someone with flowers, you have to understand something. You have to understand that they are gone, that they are not coming back, that what you are doing is not for them anymore. It is for you. That is the moment this video is about. Not the moment of the first death has been happening on this planet for billions of years, but the moment when a living creature first looked at death and understood it. When something in a hominid brain made the connection between what it was seeing and what would one day happen to itself. The moment the universe first knew, through us, that it was mortal. We do not know exactly when that moment was. We may never know exactly. But we know far more about it than most people realize. The bones, the caves, the flowers, the pigments, the carvings, the stories. All of it is evidence. All of it points, with increasing precision, toward the same astonishing conclusion. Today you will learn, when did humans first realize they were going to die? When did we first see death? When did we first lose someone of our own? When did we begin burying our dead? When did the human brain even learn to think about its own ending? Was there a moment when someone first looked at a body and understood? One day, that will be me? Today, we'll try to understand when that moment happened and what it did to us. There's an experiment you can do with almost any animal. You can place them in a room with a dead member of their own species and watch what happens. Most animals sniff the body, show brief signs of disturbance, and then move on. Some stay longer. Some display what observers describe as agitation or apparent distress. Elephants return to the bones of their dead for years, touching them with their trunks in what researchers cautiously describe as investigative behavior. Chimpanzees have been observed sitting with the bodies of dead infants for days, carrying them, grooming them, refusing to put them down. But here is what no other animal appears to do. No other animal looks at a dead member of its species and then looks at its own hands. No other animal, as far as the evidence allows us to determine, makes the conceptual leap from the observed death of another to the anticipated death of itself. The chimpanzee mother who carries her dead infant is not, as far as behavioral research can establish, projecting that experience forward in time. She is not thinking, this will happen to me. She is processing immediate grief. Profound, real, unquestionable grief. But not anticipatory grief. Not the knowledge of personal mortality. That knowledge, the specific cognitive capacity to understand that you yourself will die, that the future contains a point at which you will cease is, as best we can determine, unique to humans. And it is among the most consequential things that has ever happened in the history of mind. Everything that makes human civilization different from every other form of life on this planet flows, in one way or another, from that knowledge. Religion, art, architecture, law, medicine, philosophy, the entire apparatus of culture that separates a human settlement from a chimpanzee group, all of it can be read as a response to the awareness of death. Either an attempt to deny it, to transcend it, to give it meaning, to protect against it, to leave something behind that will outlast it, or to understand it well enough that its terror diminishes. Every cathedral ever built, every poem ever written, every child ever deliberately conceived, every name ever carved into stone. All of it, in some fundamental sense, is a response to the moment when a human brain first understood that its time was limited. The question of when that moment happened is not an academic question. It is the question of when we became us. What the question actually asks. Before we can discuss when humans first understood their own mortality, we need to be precise about what that understanding actually involves. Because the phrase, awareness of death, can mean several different things, and the evidence we have speaks to different levels of that awareness with different degrees of confidence. The first and most basic level is perceptual recognition, the ability to distinguish a living member of one species from a dead one. This capacity is very widespread, In the animal kingdom, many species show behavioral changes in the presence of dead conspecifics. Some birds mob the bodies of their dead. Some social insects perform specific disposal behaviors. Perceptual recognition of death, at this level, requires no abstract cognition at all. The second level is emotional response, the capacity to experience something that can reasonably be called grief in response to the death of another, particularly a known or bonded individual. This too appears to be widespread among social mammals. The mourning behaviors of elephants, cetaceans, and great apes have been documented extensively enough that most behavioral scientists accept them as genuine emotional responses rather than instinctive routines. The third level is conceptual understanding, the capacity to represent death as a category, to understand that dead things were once alive, that the transition is permanent and irreversible, that it follows from biological causes rather than from arbitrary supernatural intervention. Research with children suggests that this conceptual framework develops between the ages of 4 and 7 in most typically developing humans, and that it requires specific cognitive capacities that are not present in earlier childhood. The fourth level, and the one most relevant to everything that follows, is what philosophers and cognitive scientists call death awareness or mortality salience. The capacity to apply the concept of death to oneself, to understand not merely that things die, but that I will die, that the future contains my absence, that this body, these thoughts, this perspective that I experience as the center of everything, all of it will end. That fourth level is what we are looking for in the archaeological record. That fourth level is what defines the moment. It is also, neuroscientists have established, deeply uncomfortable. The human brain is not well adapted to holding the concept of personal mortality in conscious awareness for extended periods. Terror management theory, one of the most empirically supported frameworks in social psychology, proposes that a significant proportion of human cultural behavior is motivated by the management of the anxiety produced by death, awareness. The research supporting this theory has been replicated across dozens of cultures and hundreds of experimental contexts. It is not a fringe idea. It is mainstream social psychology. We know death is coming. We spend most of our conscious lives not thinking about it, and we build entire civilizations to distract ourselves from it. The question is when that started. The animal that knows. To frame the question properly, it helps to understand just how unusual the human relationship with death actually is, compared to the rest of the living world. Most animals live, as the philosopher Martin Heidegger put it, without the awareness of their own finitude. They are mortal without knowing it. They experience fear, pain, the instinct to survive, but these responses are triggered by immediate threat, not by abstract anticipation. A gazelle running from a lion is not thinking about death. It is responding to immediate danger. The moment the lion is gone, the gazelle returns to grazing. The near-death experience leaves no apparent existential trace. Humans are different in a way that becomes apparent the first time you think about it clearly. A human who narrowly avoids death carries that experience forward in time as knowledge. It feeds into a pre-existing framework of understanding that says, this is what death would feel like. I have been close to it. It will come again. Eventually, it will succeed. That temporal projection, the ability to locate oneself in a future that includes one's own absence, requires a cognitive capacity that appears to be unique to humans among living species. It requires episodic memory strong enough to project forward as well as backward. It requires the capacity for abstract self-representation, not just experiencing oneself as an agent in the present moment, but representing oneself as an object that exists across time and that will, at some future point, cease to exist. This is not a small thing. It is, arguably, the most significant cognitive event in the 4-billion-year history of life on Earth, and it left evidence. Because a mind that understands its own mortality does not simply continue as before. It changes its behavior in ways that are visible in the archaeological record. It buries its dead with care. It marks the graves. It creates objects with no survival function. It makes images on the walls of caves that no one needed to make in order to survive. It begins, in short, to produce the kinds of behaviors that distinguish archaeological sites as human rather than merely hominid. The moment death awareness arrived is the moment the archaeological record changes. Our job is to find that change and to understand what caused it, the other animals, and the line between them. To appreciate how unusual human death awareness is, it helps to look carefully at the animals closest to us and at exactly where the line appears to fall. Chimpanzees, our closest living relatives, sharing approximately 98.7% of our DNA, display a range of responses to death that has been studied intensively over the past several decades. Field researchers have documented chimpanzee mothers carrying the bodies of dead infants for days or weeks, grooming them, appearing to protect them from other group members, gradually reducing their engagement with the body as it desiccates and becomes unrecognizable. Male chimpanzees have been observed sitting quietly for extended periods near the bodies of dead companions. Communities have shown what can reasonably be described as a period of behavioral disruption following the death of a dominant individual. These responses are real. They are not instinctive routines that fire automatically in the presence of a dead body. They show individual variation. They are influenced by the social relationship between the living animal and the dead one. They bear the hallmarks of genuine emotional responses to a specific loss. And, yet, no chimpanzee has been observed to prepare a burial. No chimpanzee places objects with the dead. No chimpanzee returns, days or weeks later, to the site where a companion died and sits quietly, as if in contemplation of the loss. The grief, if that is what it is, appears to be immediate and present-focused. It is about the specific absence of this specific individual in this specific moment. It is not, as far as the evidence allows us to determine, about the abstract category of death and what it implies for the living observer. The chimpanzee mourns the loss. The human mourns the loss and adds to it the knowledge, this will happen to me. That addition, that projection of the specific loss onto the general category of personal mortality, is the cognitive step that separates human death awareness from everything else the animal kingdom has shown us. It requires the capacity to move from the concrete to the abstract, from the specific case to the general principle, from the observed death of another to the anticipated death of the self. Elephants provide another reference point. Their behavior around the bones of dead elephants, touching the bones with their trunks, carrying them, returning to them across distances and years has led some researchers to propose that elephants have something like a concept of death, a category that they recognize and respond to specifically. The proposal is taken seriously enough to be the subject of ongoing research. But even if elephants do have a concept of death, even if they recognize dead elephants as dead in a categorically specific way, not simply as absent or unresponsive, there is no evidence that they apply that concept to themselves. No evidence that an elephant who has observed the death of a companion returns to its own life, changed in the specific way that human beings are changed by the same experience. The elephant does not, as far as we know, go home and think, I will die too. The human cannot avoid it. That is the entire difference, and it is enormous. But here is where the story becomes genuinely unsettling, because the evidence for death awareness in the archaeological record does not begin with modern humans. It begins with a species that went extinct, a species we spent a century dismissing as animals, and who, it turns out, may have understood death before we did. For most of the history of modern archaeology, Neanderthals were understood as the thing we were not: cognitively limited, behaviorally rigid, capable of surviving in harsh environments, but incapable of the symbolic thought, the abstract representation, the cultural elaboration that characterized modern humans. The image was of a creature that looked roughly human, walked upright, used tools, lived in groups, but lacked the interior life that would make those behaviors meaningful in any deep sense. Neanderthals were, in the dominant view of the mid-20th century, biological machines that had stumbled into a roughly human form without the mental software to make full use of it. That view has been revised so thoroughly in the past 30 years that it now bears almost no relationship to the current scientific consensus. The revision began with the burials. The evidence accumulates. Deliberate burial of the dead is not a behavior that can be explained by survival advantage in any straightforward sense. It costs time and energy. It produces no immediate material benefit. It requires carrying or moving a body, a task that carries its own costs and risks. And it implies, At minimum, that the individuals performing it have a reason to treat the dead body as something other than material to be left behind. The earliest unambiguous evidence for deliberate burial comes from Neanderthal sites. Shenadar Cave, in what is now northern Iraq, was excavated by Ralph Selecki between 1953 and 1960. The cave had been occupied repeatedly over a period of approximately 100,000 years. In one layer of occupation, Selecki's team found the remains of multiple Neanderthal individuals buried in positions that suggested deliberate placement rather than accidental preservation, limbs arranged, bodies oriented, burial locations chosen rather than random. Shanidar 4. The individual whose grave contained the flower pollen became the center of an extraordinary debate that is not fully resolved even today. The pollen, when analyzed by palynologist Arlette Leroy-Gorhan, was found to belong to several species of flowering plants whose blooming seasons were consistent with a spring burial. More significantly, the pollen clusters were concentrated in ways that suggested the flowers had been gathered and placed, rather than deposited by wind or animal activity. The plants identified, including yarrow, groundsel, grape hyacinth, and horsetail, were not random selections. Several of them have documented medicinal properties that were known to later human cultures in the same region. Yarrow is a wound-healing herb used in folk medicine across Eurasia. Groundsel has analgesic properties. The combination suggested something almost too specific to be coincidence. A burial attended not just with flowers, but with medicinal plants, as if the people laying Shanidar 4 to rest were providing him, in death, with the healing he had needed in life. Shanidar 4 had injuries, serious ones. A crushed arm healed over years. Damaged vision in one eye, signs of chronic pain throughout his skeleton. He had been cared for during his life, kept alive by the group when he could not have survived alone. And when he died, they buried him with medicine. The debate over whether the flower pollen was deliberately placed or introduced by a burrowing rodent, a hypothesis introduced by a subsequent researcher, has never been fully settled. But Shanidar 4 is not a single case. It is representative of a pattern of Neanderthal burial evidence that extends across sites in Europe, the Middle East, and Central Asia, covering a period of approximately 100,000 years. La Chapelle, Le Moustier, Spy. The site of La Chapelle-aux-Saints, in France, produced a Neanderthal burial that has been central to the debate about Neanderthal cognition since its discovery in 1908. An elderly male individual, his skeleton showing severe arthritis, the loss of most of his teeth, and numerous healed injuries, was found in a carefully excavated pit, positioned in what appeared to be a deliberate arrangement, with animal bones and flint tools placed nearby. The individual had survived to old age, despite physical conditions that would have made independent survival impossible. Severe arthritis throughout the spine, a jaw so deteriorated that he could not have chewed hard food without assistance. The evidence pointed unmistakably to a conclusion that the early 20th century was not ready to accept. Neanderthals cared for their elderly and their severely disabled. They maintained and fed individuals who contributed nothing to the immediate survival of the group, simply because those individuals were members of the group. They understood, in some sense, the value of a life beyond its practical utility. The site of Le Moustier, also in France, contained the burial of a Neanderthal adolescent, a teenager, judging by the skeletal development, laid in a flexed position with a stone hand axe near the head and burned animal bones, suggesting the presence of food offerings. Spy Cave in Belgium produced multiple Neanderthal individuals showing signs of deliberate placement. La Ferracie, again in France, contained what appeared to be a family group of Neanderthal burials, including infants, arranged in a common area. The consistency across sites separated by geography and time, France, Iraq, Belgium, Spain, cannot be explained as coincidence. It reflects a widespread, stable behavioral pattern that persisted across the Neanderthal world for tens of thousands of years. That pattern has a name. It is called mortuary behavior. And mortuary behavior requires, At minimum, understanding that the dead person is not simply sleeping, that they are not coming back, that what you do with their body matters. The pigment problem. Burial is not the only evidence for Neanderthal symbolic cognition. It may not even be the most striking. In 2018, a study published in the journal Science dated pigment use at 3 Spanish cave sites to a period predating the arrival of modern humans in Europe by at least 20,000 years. The pigments red and yellow ochre, black manganese dioxide, were found in shells that appeared to have been used as containers, mixed with other substances in a way consistent with cosmetic or symbolic application rather than practical use. Pigment use is significant because it implies abstract, symbolic thinking of a specific kind. You do not apply pigment to your body or to cave walls because it helps you find food or avoid predators. You do it to communicate something to mark yourself as belonging to a group, to participate in a ritual, to represent something that exists in the mind rather than in the immediate physical environment. Pigment use is one of the behavioral markers that archaeologists use to identify what they call behavioral modernity, the suite of cognitive capabilities that distinguishes modern human behavior from the behavior of earlier hominids. The 2018 study placed Neanderthal pigment use decades before modern humans arrived in Europe. Neanderthals were using pigment before they had ever seen a modern human, which means symbolic thinking was not something we gave them, which means it may not have been something unique to us. The implications for the question of death awareness are direct. Symbolic thinking, the capacity to represent abstract concepts in concrete form, is a prerequisite for death awareness at the level we are discussing. You cannot understand your own mortality without the ability to represent yourself as an object that exists in time, and you cannot do that without the capacity for abstract self-representation that symbolic cognition involves. If Neanderthals had symbolic cognition, and the evidence increasingly suggests they did, then the possibility that they also had death awareness cannot be dismissed on cognitive grounds alone. They buried their dead, they cared for their disabled, they used pigment in ways that imply symbolic intent. And they did all of this for 100,000 years. Without us, the debate and what it reveals. The resistance to accepting Neanderthal symbolic cognition, the decades-long insistence by a significant portion of the paleoanthropological establishment that Neanderthal burial and pigment use were either accidental or the product of imitation rather than independent invention, is itself revealing. The debate has never been purely scientific. It has always carried the weight of a prior commitment, the commitment to human uniqueness, to the idea that what we are self-aware, symbolically thinking, death-aware beings is something that evolved once in our specific lineage, and that other lineages, however similar in form, lacked in substance. This commitment is understandable. It is emotionally and philosophically resonant. If Neanderthals had symbolic cognition, if they experienced something that can reasonably be called grief, if they stood over the graves of their companions and felt what we feel in similar moments, then our relationship to them is not the relationship of fully cognitive beings to something that only resembled cognition from the outside. It is the relationship of one grieving species to another, and we killed them. Not deliberately, probably. Not through planned extermination in most cases. But the arrival of modern humans in Europe and the Middle East corresponds closely with the disappearance of Neanderthals from the fossil record. Competition for resources, interbreeding that gradually diluted the Neanderthal genetic line, disease transmission to which Neanderthals had no prior immunity, and perhaps, in some places and times, direct violence. Whatever the mechanism, the outcome was the same. A lineage that had buried its dead for 100,000 years, that had placed flowers in graves, and cared for its disabled, and painted its bodies with pigment, disappeared from the world. And modern humans, who were doing the same things and had been doing them for at least as long, continued. We did not inherit the world from beings without death awareness. We inherited it from beings who had death awareness and lost anyway. That changes what we are. That changes what our survival means. The research has continued to accumulate. The 2021 discovery of what appears to be a deliberately constructed ritual space in a Neanderthal cave in Spain-sealed chambers, carefully arranged objects, evidence of fire use that does not correspond to any practical function, has strengthened the case for Neanderthal symbolic behavior considerably. More ancient DNA studies have confirmed that the Neanderthal contribution to modern human genomes is larger and more functionally significant than previously thought. The picture that emerges is not of a sharp boundary between two kinds of mind, but of a continuum, a range of cognitive sophistication across multiple related lineages, of which we are the only surviving example. We are the last mind standing, in a world that once had several, all of them, apparently, aware of death, all of them building something in response to that awareness. Only one of them still here to remember. Because if death awareness was present in Neanderthals, if they felt the same thing we feel when we stand over a grave, then their extinction is not just a biological event. It is a tragedy we are only now beginning to comprehend, and it raises a question about what death awareness actually does to a species. In September 2019, a team of archaeologists working in a limestone cave on the Indonesian island of Sulawesi made a discovery that required the entire field of paleoanthropology to revise its understanding of where modern human symbolic behavior began. On the cave wall, beneath layers of calcium carbonate deposited over millennia, they found a painting. Not a sketch, not a few lines suggesting an animal shape. A fully realized, compositionally sophisticated painting of a hunting scene, multiple animal figures, including a Sulawesi warty pig, arranged in spatial relationship to each other, with small, human-like figures interacting with the animals in a way that implied narrative, a scene with action, a scene with story. The uranium series dating returned an age of at least 43,900 years, the oldest known figurative art in the world, by a significant margin, found not in Europe where the Lascaux and Altamira caves had defined the standard for ancient art, but in Southeast Asia, in a cave on an island that early modern humans had reached by crossing open ocean, before they had entered Europe, before they had developed the technologies that the European Upper Paleolithic is famous for. The discovery forced a revision not just of the timeline, but of the geography of symbolic thought. The capacity for sophisticated pictorial representation was not a European invention. It was not the product of a specific cultural flowering in a specific region. It was present from near the beginning of the modern human dispersal, carried by the people who left Africa, who crossed the sea to reach Sulawesi, who arrived in a new world and painted the animals they hunted on the walls of their caves. Why they painted? The question of why early humans painted on cave walls is one of the oldest questions in the study of prehistoric art, and it has never been fully answered. The earliest interpretation proposed in the late 19th century, and dominant for several decades, was hunting magic. The paintings were sympathetic ritual objects, created to ensure success in the hunt by establishing a spiritual connection between the image and the animal it represented. This interpretation had the advantage of practicality. It provided a survival-related reason for behavior that otherwise seemed to have no survival function. But hunting magic does not fully account for what is actually painted on cave walls. The most famous cave painting sites, Lascaux, Altamira, Chauvet, Pec Merle, contain animals that are not primarily prey species. They contain horses, bison, deer, yes, but also lions, bears, rhinoceroses, mammoths, animals that were dangerous, not hunted. Animals that, if anything, represented threat rather than prey. A more recent and more widely accepted interpretation places cave painting in the context of shamanistic ritual-altered states of consciousness induced through sensory deprivation, rhythmic drumming, psychoactive substances, or extended isolation in the dark, during which the cave wall was understood as a membrane between the ordinary world and the spirit world, and the act of painting was understood as making contact with the forces that animated the painted forms. This interpretation is supported by the locations of many cave paintings. They are not in the accessible, well-lit areas near cave entrances. They are deep in the cave systems, in passages that required hours of travel through complete darkness, in chambers that required crawling through narrow openings, in locations chosen specifically for their remoteness from the ordinary world. The paintings were not made to be seen casually. They were made in the context of deliberate, difficult journeys into darkness. Journeys that, in the symbolic language of every culture that has ever used the cave as a ritual space, represent the journey into death. The cave, in this reading, was the underworld. The journey into it was a controlled, ritual experience of death and return. The paintings on its walls were messages left at the boundary between the living world and whatever lay beyond it. The oldest art in the world was made by people thinking about death. Not incidentally, not accidentally, deliberately, as the central subject. The hand stencils, among the most evocative elements of prehistoric cave art, are the hand stencils, images of human hands made by pressing a hand against the cave wall and blowing pigment around it, leaving a negative impression in the shape of the hand. They appear at sites across the world, on every continent where there are accessible cave systems that preserve pigment. They appear at Chauvet in France, dated to approximately 36,000 years ago. They appear at Cosquer Cave, accessible only through an underwater passage since sea levels rose at the end of the last ice age. They appear at the cave of El Castillo in Spain, where some examples are dated to at least 40,000 years ago. They appear in Australia, in Argentina, in Indonesia, in South Africa. The hand stencil is the simplest and most universal form of prehistoric image making. It requires minimal technical skill. It is accessible to anyone with pigment and the ability to blow. Children's hands appear alongside adults. Hands with missing fingers appear, suggesting injury or perhaps deliberate amputation as part of ritual practice. But what does a hand stencil mean? The most immediate interpretation, proposed by scholars as diverse as Leroy Gorham, and more recently by behavioral psychologist David Lewis Williams, is that it is an assertion of presence. I was here. This is my hand. In a world before writing, before names could be recorded, before any of the technologies by which modern humans assert their individual existence across time, the hand stencil says, there was a being here, and this is the shape of part of them. It is, in other words, a response to mortality. You make a hand stencil because you understand that you will not always be here, because some part of you wants to leave a trace that will outlast your body, because the recognition of personal mortality creates a drive documented now in dozens of experimental studies, to assert one's continued significance, to leave something behind, to ensure that the fact of one's existence is recorded somewhere. The hand stencil is the simplest possible version of what every cathedral, every gravestone, every published book, every painted portrait attempts to do. It is the assertion of a person against the erasure of time. It is the first thing humans made when they understood they were going to die. The red ochre burials. Pigment and burial converge in one of the most striking patterns in the archaeological record of early modern human behavior. The red ochre burial. At sites across Africa, Europe, and Asia, spanning a period from approximately 100,000 years ago to the early Neolithic, the bodies of the dead were covered or surrounded with red ochre, a natural iron oxide pigment that ranges in color from orange yellow to deep blood red. The practice is so widespread and so consistent that it constitutes one of the clearest behavioral markers for modern human cognition in the archaeological record. Red ochre burial is not simple. It requires gathering the ochre, sometimes from considerable distances from the burial site. It requires processing it, grinding it to a powder of consistent fineness. It requires applying it sometimes to the body itself, sometimes to the grave goods placed with the body, sometimes to the floor and walls of the burial pit. And it requires understanding, at some level, why you are doing this, what the red means, what it is supposed to accomplish. The most widely accepted interpretation connects the red color of ochre to blood, and specifically to the idea of life itself. In cultures across the world, from the hunter-gatherer societies of the Paleolithic to the agricultural civilizations of the ancient world, red has been associated with vitality, with the life force that animates living bodies. Covering the dead in red ochre may have been understood as giving them back the life that death had taken, as ensuring that whatever animated a living person would have what it needed for the journey ahead. To cover the dead in the color of life, you have to understand what life is. And to understand what life is, you have to understand what its absence means. The oldest red ochre burial yet found dates to approximately 100,000 years ago, from the site of Kafse Kave in Israel. The individual buried there a young woman, probably in her 20s, with the skeleton of a young child at her feet, was covered in red ochre and placed in a carefully prepared grave. Nearby, perforated shell ornaments suggest that she was buried with personal adornments, objects that had meaning attached to her specific identity as a person. 100,000 years ago, someone buried a young woman with care, with color, with objects that said, she was someone, she mattered. Her going is not nothing. That act, performed 100,000 years before writing, before cities, before any of the things we call civilization, that act is recognizable to every human being who has ever stood at a graveside, because it is exactly what we still do. The burials, the paintings, the pigment, all of this is evidence of what death awareness produced. But it is not evidence of when death awareness arrived. For that, we have to go deeper, into the structure of the human brain itself, and into a revolution in neuroscience that has changed everything we thought we knew. There is a specific region of the human brain whose activity increases measurably when a person is reminded of their own death. Neuroimaging studies using fMRI technology have documented this with precision. When experimental subjects are asked to think about their own mortality, to contemplate their death in concrete terms, activation patterns appear in the prefrontal cortex, the anterior cingulate cortex, and the right hemisphere's amygdala. These regions are involved in abstract reasoning, in the integration of emotional and cognitive processing, and in the representation of the self as an object with a perspective. The same regions are involved in what neuroscientists call theory of mind, the capacity to understand that other beings have minds, that those minds contain beliefs, desires, and knowledge that may differ from one's own, and that understanding those differences matters for predicting behavior. The part of the brain that understands death is the same part that understands other people. These are not separate capacities. They are the same capacity applied in two directions. This connection is not coincidental. It reflects something fundamental about what death awareness actually is and how it emerges developmentally and evolutionarily. Theory of mind and mortality. Theory of mind, the capacity to represent other minds as objects with their own contents, is the cognitive foundation for much of what makes human social life distinctive. It underlies language acquisition, empathy, deception, cooperation, teaching, learning, and all the forms of complex social coordination that human societies depend on. It also, crucially, underlies self-awareness, because the capacity to represent another mind requires a mental model of minds in general, and once a being has a general mental model of minds, it can apply that model to its own mind. It can become, in the philosophical terminology, self-aware. It can represent itself as an object, rather than simply experiencing itself as a subject. And a self that is represented as an object is a self that can be understood as having a beginning and an end. Theory of mind leads necessarily to mortality awareness. You cannot understand other minds without the capacity to understand your own. And understanding your own mind means understanding that it is bounded in time. The developmental sequence in children confirms this connection. Children typically develop theory of mind, the ability to pass what psychologists call the false belief task, which requires understanding that another person can hold a belief that the child knows to be false, between the ages of 3 and 5. The full conceptual understanding of death permanent, irreversible, universal, biologically caused, develops in the same period, typically completing between ages 5 and 7. These are not coincidental developmental milestones. They are expressions of the same underlying cognitive development, the maturation of the prefrontal and anterior cingulate systems that support both self-representation and the representation of minds in general. Extrapolating from developmental sequence to evolutionary sequence requires caution. Children's cognitive development does not simply recapitulate evolutionary history in a reliable way, but the overlap is suggestive. It implies that the same evolutionary changes that gave our ancestors enhanced theory of mind also gave them enhanced death awareness. The two capacities arrive together. The prefrontal revolution, the human prefrontal cortex, the region behind the forehead, the last part of the brain to mature in individual development, and the region most dramatically expanded in human evolution relative to our primate relatives, is the anatomical basis for the suite of cognitive capacities that distinguish human thought from the thought of other great apes. Abstract reasoning, long-term planning, the suppression of immediate impulses in favor of anticipated future consequences, the representation of hypothetical situations that do not currently exist. the integration of emotional and cognitive information into unified decision-making, and, crucially, temporal self-location, the capacity to place oneself mentally at points in time other than the present moment, to remember the past as a place you have been, to imagine the future as a place you have not yet visited but will, and, at the extreme end of the future, to imagine a point at which you will not be there at all. The human prefrontal cortex is the organ of mortality awareness. Its expansion in the human lineage was not instantaneous. The fossil record of hominin brain endocasts, impressions of the brain left on the interior surface of fossilized skulls, allows paleoneurologists to track the relative size and surface organization of different brain regions across several million years of human evolution. The trend toward prefrontal expansion is clear in the fossil record, but it is not linear. There are periods of relative stasis and periods of accelerated change. The most dramatic acceleration appears to have occurred in two main pulses. One, around 2 million years ago, associated with the emergence of the genus Homo, and a second, more subtle reorganization that appears to have occurred in the period between approximately 300,000 and 100,000 years ago, the period that coincides with the emergence of anatomically and behaviorally modern humans in Africa. That second reorganization is, in the current state of the evidence, the best candidate for the evolutionary moment when death awareness in its fully modern form became possible. When the prefrontal temporal integration required for full temporal self-representation reached the threshold at which a being could project itself forward in time, far enough to locate its own death in the future, and understand that location, the cognitive revolution, and its trigger. The question of what triggered the behavioral revolution visible in the archaeological record of the Upper Paleolithic, the appearance of symbolic art, complex ritual behavior, long-distance trade networks, and all the other markers of behavioral modernity, has been one of the central debates in paleoanthropology for decades. The traditional answer was a single mutation, a change in brain organization that occurred approximately 50,000 years ago and produced, more or less suddenly, the cognitive capacities that distinguish modern human behavior from the behavior of earlier hominids. This was sometimes called the cultural Big Bang hypothesis, the idea that there was a specific moment when modern cognition switched on, after which everything changed. The evidence has moved consistently against this simple interpretation. The behavioral markers of modernity appear earlier and earlier in the archaeological record, as excavation techniques improve and dating methods become more precise. Red ochre used in South Africa at 100,000 years ago. Engraved geometric patterns at Blombos Cave at 75,000 years ago. Shell beads used as personal ornaments at 100,000 years ago. The timeline of behavioral modernity keeps getting pushed back. What this implies is not a sudden switch, but a long accumulation. The cognitive capacities that underlie behavioral modernity, including death awareness, were not a single mutation that arrived all at once. They were a constellation of related capacities that developed gradually, over tens of thousands of years, each development building on those that preceded it, until the combination reached a threshold at which the full suite of modern human behaviors became possible. Death awareness, in this framework, was not the first of these capacities to appear. It was probably one of the last to reach its full modern form. It required all the others: enhanced memory, enhanced theory of mind, enhanced temporal self-representation, enhanced integration of emotional and cognitive processing to be in place before it could operate at full cognitive depth. It was the final piece of a very long assembly, and when it clicked into place, everything changed. Language and the death that does not exist, yet. There is one more cognitive capacity that plays a central role in mortality awareness, and it is one that is rarely discussed in this context, despite its obvious relevance. Language. Not language as a communication system. Other species have that, in various forms, but language as a medium for representing things that do not currently exist. The capacity to say, there was a time before this, and there will be a time after this, and in that time after, I will not be here. Grammatical tense is, in this sense, one of the most philosophically consequential features of human language. The past tense allows a speaker to represent states of affairs that are no longer the case. The future tense allows a speaker to represent states of affairs that are not yet the case. The combination allows a speaker to place themselves in a temporal sequence to understand themselves as a being who has a history and who will have a continuation of that history until the point at which the continuation ends. Grammar makes death thinkable in a specific way. The sentence, "I will die," requires not only the concept of death and the concept of self, but the ability to combine them across a temporal gap to project the self into a future moment and locate its absence there. This is a specific linguistic operation that draws on the same prefrontal and temporal lobe systems involved in temporal self-location more generally. When language and temporal self-representation evolve together as they appear to have done, since the archaeological signatures of both appear in roughly the same period of human prehistory, the result was a mind capable not just of knowing death abstractly, but of knowing its own death specifically. Not just, things die, but I, this specific self that I experience as the center of everything, will die at a future point that I cannot precisely specify, and I will not know it is happening until it is too late to do anything about it. That specific knowledge, personal, anticipatory, certain, is what no other animal appears to have, and it is what the full development of human language makes possible in a way that pre-linguistic or proto-linguistic cognition does not. We think our deaths in sentences, and sentences gave us a terror that no other creature on Earth has had to manage. The management of that terror, the invention of religion, art, philosophy, and all the other cultural systems that help humans live with what they know, required exactly the same linguistic and cognitive sophistication that created the terror in the first place. The solution and the problem arrived together. The capacity that made death unendurable also made it bearable. Language told us we were going to die, and language gave us stories to tell ourselves about what that meant. Because here is what the research says about what happens to a mind that understands its own mortality. Here is what death awareness does, not just to individuals, but to civilizations. In 1973, the cultural anthropologist Ernest Becker published a book called The Denial of Death. It won the Pulitzer Prize the following year, shortly after Becker died of colon cancer. He had been dying while he wrote it. He knew the subject not only academically, but as immediate, personal reality. The thesis of the book was simple, radical, and, in the decades since its publication, increasingly supported by empirical research. Human civilization is, at its foundation, a response to the terror of death. Not incidentally, not partially, fundamentally. The religions, the ideologies, the cultures, the social structures, the artistic and intellectual achievements of human civilization, all of it, Becker argued, can be understood as a collectively constructed defense against the awareness of personal mortality, a system for managing the terror that death awareness produces by embedding the individual in something larger and more permanent than the individual body. Join the church, and your soul is eternal. Serve the state, and your sacrifice will be remembered forever. Have children, and something of you will persist after your body is gone. Create art, and your work will outlast you. Accumulate status and wealth, and you will be significant in a world that death threatens to make meaningless. Every immortality project, as Becker called them, is a way of not dying, of insisting, against the evidence of every experience, that something of you will remain. When psychologists Jeff Greenberg, Tom Pyszczynski, and Sheldon Solomon read Becker's book in the 1980s, they decided to test it empirically. The result was Terror Management Theory, a research program that has now produced over 500 peer-reviewed studies across dozens of countries, testing the specific prediction that reminders of personal mortality change human behavior in specific, measurable ways. The experimental paradigm of terror management theory is elegant in its simplicity. You take two groups of participants. You ask one group to think about death specifically, to write about what they think will happen to them physically when they die, and to describe the emotions that thinking about their own death evokes. The other group, the control, is asked to write about something unpleasant, but not death-related, such as dental pain. Then you measure something apparently unrelated. The dependent variable has ranged across hundreds of different studies. How harshly people judge those who violate their cultural values, how warmly people respond to someone who shares their cultural identity, how much distance they put between themselves and things that remind them of their animal nature, eating, sex, death itself, how aggressively they respond to threats to their worldview, how generously they give to causes that represent the cultural values they identify with. The result, replicated hundreds of times in dozens of cultures, is consistent and striking. Thinking about death changes how we see the world. When people are reminded of their mortality, they often become more attached to the beliefs, values, and communities that give their lives meaning. They may feel a stronger connection to their cultural identity, more appreciation for those who share their worldview, and more caution toward ideas that challenge it. They may also become more generous toward causes that affirm their sense of purpose, and more protective of the systems that help them feel grounded. Importantly, these shifts usually happen outside conscious awareness. People believe they are simply reacting to the situation in front of them, a decision to make, a person to judge, a cause to support, without realizing that reflections on mortality may be subtly shaping their responses. In this sense, awareness of death can influence human behavior quietly, beneath the surface of deliberate thought. The scale of the effect. Terror management theory suggests that this dynamic may help explain patterns not only in individuals, but also across societies. When communities feel threatened by conflict, instability, or uncertainty, the resulting awareness of vulnerability can strengthen group cohesion, deepen commitment to shared beliefs, and heighten sensitivity to perceived challenges from outside. Across history, moments of crisis have often coincided with stronger identities, stronger loyalties, and sometimes stronger divisions. From religious conflicts to nationalist movements, scholars have noted that collective fear and uncertainty can intensify the human need for meaning, continuity, and symbolic legacy. This does not mean mortality awareness alone causes conflict, but it may help explain why, in uncertain times, people cling more tightly to the systems of belief that promise stability, identity, or lasting significance. If this perspective is correct, then the emergence of human awareness of death did not only bring anxiety, it also helped shape culture, belief, cooperation, and the search for meaning itself. Our awareness of mortality may be one of the forces that pushed humans to create stories, values, and communities, things that outlast the individual life. Not just a source of fear, but a source of meaning, the other side of terror. But Becker's analysis, and the terror management theory research it inspired, also points towards something that is not only dark, because the same drive that produces religious warfare and ethnic persecution also produces every cathedral ever built, every symphony ever composed, every mathematical proof ever discovered, every act of care extended to a stranger dying alone in a hospital ward. Death awareness does not only produce violence and tribalism, it also produces the need to leave something meaningful behind, to create something that will outlast the creator, to establish connections with other people that feel worth preserving, to invest in projects and relationships and ideas that seem larger than a single life. The Lascaux cave paintings are 45 feet underground, in passages that required hours of travel through complete darkness to reach. No one needed to make them in order to survive. They required enormous investment of time, effort, pigment, and skill. They were made anyway. The builders of Göbekli Tepe quarried and moved 20-ton stone pillars before agriculture existed, before cities existed, before any of the organizational infrastructure that supposedly makes such projects possible. They built a monument to something that we do not fully understand, but that clearly mattered to them enormously. A monument that they then deliberately buried, preserved against the future, against a time when it would matter to people they would never meet. They were doing, 12,000 years ago, exactly what we are doing now, leaving something behind for people they would never know, reaching across time toward a future that would not include them. That is the other face of death awareness. Not the terror, the generosity. The recognition that time is limited produces, in some minds and in some moments, not desperation, but care. The understanding that your own life is finite gives you a reason to invest in something beyond your own life. Death awareness is the source of the worst in us, and the best, both, simultaneously, from the same moment of understanding. When children learn, the developmental trajectory through which individual human children come to understand death is one of the most studied topics in developmental psychology, and it illuminates the evolutionary question in ways that are rarely appreciated. Before the age of approximately 3, children have essentially no understanding of death as a category. Death does not distinguish itself, in a child's cognitive framework, from sleep, absence, or other forms of temporary unavailability. When a child of this age is told that a grandparent has died, the typical response involves asking when the person will be coming back. The concept of permanent irreversibility is simply not present. Between 3 and 5, the concept begins to assemble itself, piece by piece. The child learns that dead things do not move, do not breathe, do not eat. The concept acquires concrete content. Death means the cessation of biological functions. But universality and personal applicability are still absent. Death is something that happens to animals, to old people, perhaps to strangers. Not to me, not to the people I depend on. Between 5 and 7, the full concept crystallizes. The child comes to understand that death is universal, that everything that lives will die, and that it is personal that I, specifically, will die. This moment of understanding is sometimes visible to parents and teachers as a behavioral shift. Children in this age range frequently begin asking questions about death with an intensity that surprises the adults around them. They have nightmares. They worry about the deaths of their parents in a way they did not previously. They sometimes exhibit what looks like existential anxiety, a free-floating unease that has no specific immediate cause, but that, when traced, connects to the newly arrived knowledge that the world contains death and that death contains them. The arrival of mortality awareness in individual children is a small crisis. Every child goes through it. Most adults around them do not know how to respond because they are still managing the same crisis themselves. The management strategies develop shortly after. The reassurances of religion, where applicable. The distraction of activity. The gradual development of the suppression mechanisms that terror management theory describes the ability to hold the knowledge of death just below the surface of conscious attention, accessible when needed, but not constantly present. By late childhood and adolescence, most individuals have developed a working relationship with their mortality that allows them to function without constant existential paralysis. But the crisis is never fully resolved. It is only managed. And the management costs something, costs attention, costs energy, costs the cognitive resources that the suppression mechanisms require to maintain. We spend our whole lives paying the cognitive tax of knowing we are mortal. The tax is invisible because we have been paying it since we were 6. But it is real. And everything we build to avoid paying it, every religion, every legacy project, every relationship invested with eternal significance, is real too. So when did that moment happen? When did the first mind look at death and understand what it was seeing? The evidence points to a specific answer, and that answer is stranger and more moving than most people expect. We cannot point to a single moment. The evidence does not allow that kind of precision, and it probably never will. What the evidence allows is the identification of a range, a period, during which the behavioral markers of death awareness accumulate with increasing density, suggesting that the underlying cognitive capacity was developing during that period toward its full modern form. That range begins approximately 300,000 years ago, with the earliest evidence of what might be deliberate burial in archaic Homo sapiens. It reaches a clear threshold around 100,000 years ago, with the unambiguous burial evidence at Kafsa and similar sites. And it extends into a period of full behavioral modernity between 40 and 60,000 years ago, when the complete suite of symbolic behaviors, art, music, personal adornment, long-distance exchange of objects with symbolic value, complex burial ritual appears across multiple continents simultaneously. Within that range, there is one site that stands at the beginning of everything, one find that has been examined, debated, challenged, and reconfirmed more times than any other in the study of the prehistoric mind. It is in Morocco. It is 420,000 years old, and it is not a burial. The Pit of Bones, the site of Atapuerca in northern Spain, has been producing hominin fossils since the 1970s. The cave system contains a pit, the Cima de los Huesos, the Pit of Bones, at the bottom of which archaeologists have found the skeletal remains of at least 28 individual hominins, dated to approximately 430,000 years ago. The individuals represent a species now called Homo heidelbergensis, the population from which both Neanderthals in Europe and modern humans in Africa eventually descended. They are not modern humans, and they are not Neanderthals. They are something before both. The pit itself is accessible only through a narrow 13-meter vertical shaft. The bones are concentrated at the bottom in a way that has no natural explanation. They did not fall there accidentally. They did not accumulate through predator activity. The analysis of the remains shows no evidence of carnivore gnawing, no evidence of water transport, no stratigraphic pattern consistent with natural accumulation. 28 bodies, thrown into a pit, 430,000 years ago. The standard interpretation, accepted by most researchers who have studied the site, is that this represents deliberate mortuary behavior, the intentional disposal of the dead in a specific location. Not burial in the full sense of a carefully prepared individual grave, but intentional, collective, repeated placement of the dead in a designated space. With the bodies, a single object was found, a hand axe, made from an unusual red quartzite that does not occur naturally anywhere near Atapuerca, carefully napped to a distinctive biface form. Not used, its edges show no signs of use wear, suggesting it was never employed as a cutting tool. An unused tool, made from exotic material, found with 28 bodies in a pit. If this were found in a Bronze Age context, no archaeologist would hesitate to call it a grave offering. A deliberate inclusion in a burial, placed not for practical use, but for symbolic reasons connected to the identity or the afterlife journey of the deceased. Found 430,000 years ago, it forces a different kind of reckoning. It forces the question of whether the beings who placed those bodies and that hand axe in that pit understood, in some form, what they were doing. Whether they had some conception, however different from ours, of death as a transition rather than simply a cessation. Whether the red hand axe was meant to accompany the dead on a journey or simply to mark the significance of what had happened. We do not know. We cannot know. But the pit exists. The hand axe exists. The absence of any natural explanation for either of them exists, and they are 430,000 years old. Morocco and the oldest intentional burial. The site of Jebel Irhoud in Morocco has repeatedly rewritten the timeline of anatomically modern human origins. In 2017, a reanalysis of fossils found there in the 1960s, combined with new excavations, produced dates of approximately 315,000 years, pushing back the origin of anatomically modern Homo sapiens by 100,000 years from the previously accepted estimate. What the site also produced, less publicized but equally significant, was evidence for deliberate preparation of the dead, ochre processing, careful placement of skeletal remains, behavioral markers that, while not as elaborate as the full burial rituals of the later record, suggest that the beings at Jebel Irhoud were already treating their dead in ways that went beyond simple disposal. 315,000 years ago, in Morocco, at the very dawn of the anatomically modern human lineage, the earliest anatomically modern humans left evidence of mortuary behavior almost immediately, as if the mind that had just become modern could not help but respond to death differently, as if death awareness and anatomical modernity arrived together. Whether they arrived together because they were produced by the same underlying neurological changes, or because one produced the other, because anatomical modernity enabled the cognitive development that led to death awareness, remains uncertain. But the temporal coincidence is striking enough that it has moved several researchers to propose a direct connection, that the reorganization of the brain that produced anatomically modern Homo sapiens also, necessarily, produced the cognitive architecture for full death awareness. The children. Among the most affecting evidence in this entire field of inquiry is the treatment of children in early human burial sites. At Sungir, a site in Russia dated to approximately 32,000 years ago, 2 children, a boy and a girl, approximately 12 and 9 years old, respectively, were found buried head to head in an elaborate grave. Their bodies were covered with thousands of mammoth ivory beads that had been sewn onto their clothing. Spears made from straightened mammoth ivory flanked them. Fox teeth, carved ivory, perforated shells, and other objects accompanied them. The total number of ivory beads found at the Sungir burials exceeds 10,000. Experimental archaeology has established that each bead required approximately 45 minutes to produce. 10,000 beads represents approximately 7,500 hours of skilled labor, nearly a year of continuous work for a single craftsperson, working every hour of every day. This labor was invested in the burial of 2 children, in a world where survival was not guaranteed, where every hour of productive work had a direct relationship to whether the group lived through the winter, where the margin between adequate food stores and starvation was thin enough that any expenditure of resources had to be justified against immediate need. And they spent 7,500 hours making beads for children who were already dead. The investment can only be explained by a belief system that attributed to the dead, even dead children, significance and requirements that extended beyond their biological ending. A belief that they continued to exist in some form, that they needed objects and adornments for that continued existence, that sending them into whatever came after death well provisioned was worth the enormous cost of providing the provisions. This is not instinct. This is theology. This is an organized, coherent response to death awareness. This is the beginning of religion. The African cradle and its evidence. The case for Africa, as the place where death awareness reached its fully modern form, is built on a remarkable concentration of evidence from a relatively small number of sites, all dated to the period between approximately 300,000 and 70,000 years ago. Blombo's Cave, on the southern coast of South Africa, has been one of the most productive sites in the archaeology of early modern human cognition since its systematic excavation began in the 1990s. From sediments dated to approximately 75,000 years ago, the site has produced engraved geometric patterns on pieces of ochre, the oldest known abstract symbolic engravings, along with perforated shell beads that appear to have been worn as personal ornaments, and a small stone workshop where ochre was ground and mixed with other substances in what appears to have been a deliberate preparation process. The ochre workshop is particularly significant. The shells used as containers still held traces of a prepared mixture ochre combined with crushed bone, charcoal, and a liquid binding agent, ground to a specific consistency. This was not casual pigment use. It was a prepared compound, mixed according to a procedure that required knowledge and intention. The preparation of a specific substance for a specific symbolic purpose, at 75,000 years ago, implies a level of abstract intentionality that is difficult to attribute to beings without the cognitive architecture for death awareness. The Border Cave site in KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa, has produced evidence of deliberate burial of an infant, wrapped in a shroud and placed in a prepared grave dated to approximately 74,000 years ago. The infant was buried with a perforated marine shell, suggesting intentional placement of an object with it. This is, currently, among the oldest clear evidence of infant burial anywhere in the world. 74,000 years ago, someone buried an infant, wrapped it, prepared its grave, placed an object with it, did all the things that humans have done with their dead ever since. The implications of infant burial are particularly significant for the question of death awareness. Burying an infant serves no practical purpose. An infant who has died is not a threat. Its body, in the climate of southern Africa, would decompose relatively quickly without burial. The decision to bury, to prepare a grave, to wrap the body, to place objects with it, can only be explained by a belief system that attributed to the infant a significance beyond its practical role in the group, a significance that persisted after its death, a significance that required acknowledgement through ritual action. Infants do not have social status in the sense that adults do. They have not contributed to the group. They have not formed the bonds that might explain elaborate mourning as an expression of social loss. The only explanation for burying an infant with care is love, the specific form of love that death awareness produces. The recognition that this particular small life mattered, that its ending is not nothing, that something is owed to it even now that it is gone. To bury an infant with care is to understand that all lives have inherent value, not earned value, not demonstrated value, inherent value. That is a philosophical position, and it was reached 74,000 years ago in southern Africa. The burials, the art, the beads, the flowers, they are all the same thing. They are all the same response to the same unbearable knowledge. And that knowledge shaped everything that came after. Every major religion on earth is organized around death. Not secondarily, not as one concern among many. Death is what religions are for. They answer the questions that death awareness poses. Is there something after? Does the self survive the body? Was this life meaningful? Will those I loved continue to exist in some form? Is the suffering of existence redeemed by something beyond it? These are not questions that arise in the absence of death awareness. They arise specifically because a mind that understands its own mortality cannot live comfortably with the implications. The terror that death awareness produces requires management, and the most consistent form that management has taken across every human culture in history is religious belief. This is not a statement about whether religious beliefs are true. It is a statement about their function, the cognitive and emotional need they serve, independent of whether their content is accurate. They manage the anxiety of mortality by providing frameworks within which personal death is not final. The first temples. The oldest known religious site in the world is Göbekli Tepe. Dated to approximately 12,000 years ago, it predates any known agricultural settlement. It was built by hunter-gatherers who had no permanent homes and no obvious need for permanent public architecture. And it was built at a scale and with a technical sophistication that required sustained collective effort over multiple generations. The carvings on its pillars are primarily of animals, vultures, foxes, scorpions, snakes, cranes, wild boar. The arrangement of the enclosures shows astronomical alignment. The location, on a high ridge visible from the surrounding plains, suggests that visibility and monumentality were part of the intention. Researchers who have studied the site most carefully, including the lead excavator Klaus Schmidt until his death in 2014, have consistently interpreted it as a ritual site rather than a residential one. A place where people gathered from a wide surrounding region for ceremonies whose specific nature we cannot recover, but whose importance is evident from the investment they inspired. The vulture carvings are particularly significant. Vultures appear in the funerary practices of multiple later cultures in the same region, including sky burial, the practice of placing bodies on elevated platforms to be consumed by birds of prey, which was understood as the first stage of a journey from the material world into the spiritual one. If the vulture imagery at Göbekli Tepe carries similar meaning, and the hypothesis has been proposed by several researchers, then the oldest known temple in the world was organized, at least in part, around the management of death. The first thing humans built at monumental scale was a temple. The first thing a temple addressed was death, Egypt, and the architecture of immortality. No civilization has expressed the human response to death awareness more completely, more elaborately, or more durably than ancient Egypt. The pyramids are the most obvious expression of this monuments of such massive permanence that they were understood by their builders as literal guarantees of immortality. If the king's name was inscribed on something permanent enough to outlast time itself, then the king would not die. Not really, not completely. The pyramid was not a tomb in the ordinary sense. It was a machine for immortality, constructed on the theory that permanent stone plus inscribed name plus correct ritual equaled continued existence. The entire apparatus of Egyptian civilization, the priesthood, the mummification industry, the Book of the Dead, the elaborate system of funerary texts and rituals developed over 3,000 years, was organized around managing death. Not just the deaths of kings, the deaths of everyone who could afford to participate in the system. Ordinary Egyptians who could not afford pyramids had Shapti's small figurines buried with them to perform any labor they might be required to do in the afterlife. They had Ushaptis guardian figures to protect them in the dangerous passages of the underworld. They had copies of the Book of the Dead, a practical manual for navigating the afterlife, placed in their coffins. The entire industry of Egyptian funerary practice, employing tens of thousands of people across 3,000 years of civilization, was the largest organized response to death anxiety in human history. Egypt was death awareness made into stone, made into gold, made into text, made into an entire civilization organized around the refusal to accept that the self simply ends. The first stories about death. The Epic of Gilgamesh, the oldest surviving long-form narrative in any language, written on clay tablets in ancient Mesopotamia approximately 4,000 years ago, but clearly drawing on oral traditions much older, is, at its core, a story about one person's confrontation with death awareness. Gilgamesh is 2/3 divine and 1/3 human. He is the greatest king in the world. He is invincible in battle. He has everything that human ambition can aspire to. And then his companion Enkidu dies. Enkidu is not simply a friend. He is the other half of Gilgamesh, his equal, his counterpart, the one person in the world who could match him. Their friendship is one of the great love stories of ancient literature, in the original sense of love that encompasses everything that makes another person irreplaceable. When Enkidu dies, Gilgamesh does something that the modern reader recognizes immediately. He panics, not with grief, exactly, with terror, because Enkidu's death is the first time Gilgamesh has understood, really understood, in the specific way that death awareness operates, that he too will die. He had known it abstractly. Now he knows it with his whole mind. He leaves his city. He abandons his throne. He wanders in the wilderness, trying to find a way to not die. He seeks Utnapishtim, the one human being who survived the Great Flood and was granted immortality by the gods. He finds him, and Utnapishtim sets him a simple test: stay awake for 7 days and 7 nights. Gilgamesh falls asleep immediately. He cannot do it. He goes home. The journey has taught him nothing that will change his fate and everything that will change how he lives with it. The walls of Uruk, that he built the city he created, the monument that will outlast him, are shown to him at the end as the answer the poem offers. Not immortality, permanence. Not endless life, enduring work. Not the self surviving, the self's creation surviving. The Epic of Gilgamesh is 4,000 years old, and it is, in its essential structure, identical to every conversation that has ever been had between a human being and a therapist about mortality, anxiety. The crisis, the flight, the futile attempt to escape, the return, the acceptance, the discovery that what death awareness produces is not meaninglessness, but the need to create meaning that will outlast the individual who creates it. The oldest story ever told is about the moment we realized we were going to die, and about what we decided to do about it. The Greeks and the philosophy of the inevitable. Ancient Greece produced the first systematic philosophical engagement with death, the first tradition in which thinkers sat down and attempted to reason, rigorously and without the protection of myth, about what death actually is, and how a person should relate to the knowledge of it. The results were startlingly diverse. Different schools arrived at radically different conclusions from the same starting premises, and the diversity of their conclusions reflects the genuine difficulty of the problem, rather than any simple error in reasoning. Epicurus argued that death should produce no fear at all, for the simple reason that when death arrives, the person who would experience it ceases to exist. Where death is, I am not, he wrote. Where I am, death is not. The confrontation between the self and death is, in this framework, a logical impossibility the two can never meet, because the existence of one requires the absence of the other. Therefore, fear of death is irrational. It is the fear of a non-experience. This argument is logically valid. It has convinced almost no one in the 2,500 years since Epicurus made it, because we do not fear death as an experience. We fear the loss of experience, the cessation of the specific perspective that we inhabit, the disappearance of everything we love and know. Epicurus is right that there will be no one to mourn when we die, but there is someone to mourn it now. Plato took the opposite approach. In the dialogue surrounding the death of Socrates, particularly the Phaedo, which purports to record Socrates' final conversations on the day of his execution, he argued that death should be welcomed by the philosopher because the soul's liberation from the body represents the beginning of its true existence. The body is a prison, a source of distraction and error. Death is the moment the philosopher has been preparing for. Philosophy itself, Socrates says, is nothing but practice for dying. The Stoics took yet another approach, one that has proven more durable than either of the others in terms of its practical influence on how people actually live. The Stoic response to mortality was memento mori, the deliberate, regular contemplation of death as a practice for living fully. If you know that your time is limited, then every moment of it has a weight that it would not have for an immortal being. The Stoic keeps death visible at the edge of consciousness not to produce anxiety, but to prevent the complacency that an immortal being might feel. Every conversation, every meal, every day of health, all of it experienced with the sharpness that the knowledge of its impermanence creates. Memento mori. Remember that you will die, not as a threat, as an invitation to be here, fully, while you still can. These three responses, the denial of the problem, the embrace of death as transcendence, and the practice of mortality contemplation, represent the full range of strategies that humans have developed for managing death awareness. Every religious and philosophical tradition that has addressed mortality falls somewhere within this range. The Greeks simply named the positions with unusual clarity, and the fact that they could name them, that they could sit down and reason systematically about death as a philosophical problem, is itself evidence of how thoroughly death awareness had been integrated into the human, cognitive, and cultural framework by the classical period. Death was not, for the Greeks, an unspeakable terror to be managed through ritual alone. It was a topic for discussion, a problem with multiple possible approaches, a question serious enough to be worth a philosopher's life. Socrates chose to die rather than abandon his philosophical practice. He chose his answer to the death question and kept choosing it until it cost him everything. That, too, is what death awareness makes possible. The decision to die well, 430,000 years of burial rituals, 100,000 years of ochre and flowers, 40,000 years of cave paintings, 4,000 years of the oldest story ever written. All of it the same response to the same knowledge, and all of it leading, inevitably, to us. The question this video began with, when humans first realized they would die, doesn't have a single clear answer. There was no one moment when a person suddenly woke up and understood mortality for the first time. Instead, this awareness emerged gradually, over hundreds of thousands of years, as human minds slowly developed the capacity to reflect on themselves, on time, and on the future. But there is another question, perhaps more meaningful. What did this knowledge do to us? A knowledge that shaped humanity. Awareness of mortality seems to have influenced many of the things we consider most human. It helped give rise to religion, the attempt to place death within a larger story that offers continuity, meaning, or hope beyond a single lifetime. It encouraged art, the desire to leave something behind, to shape the world in a way that continues after we are gone. From cave paintings to modern music, creation often carries the quiet wish to be remembered. It deepened philosophy, the effort to understand what makes a life meaningful, and how we should spend the limited time we have. And it may also be one of the reasons love feels so profound. Knowing that time is limited gives relationships weight. Moments become precious because they cannot last forever. Grief, too, reflects this reality. When we lose someone, we feel not only their absence but also the fragility of our shared time. Loss reminds us how much connection matters. A human paradox, awareness of death can be unsettling, but it has also inspired some of humanity's most meaningful achievements. It has sometimes fueled fear and division, yet it has also motivated creativity, compassion, and cooperation. The same awareness that can produce anxiety can also inspire people to build, to care, and to leave the world better than they found it. Across history, many people have responded to mortality not with destruction, but with creation through art, ritual, community, and acts of kindness. Perhaps that possibility is part of our inheritance too. To understand that life is finite and still choose to add something good to it. What the flower says. Let us return at the end to where we began. The flower in the Neanderthal grave at Shanidar Cave. The flower has been debated for decades. The gerbil hypothesis that the pollen was deposited by a burrowing rodent rather than placed by a morning, Neanderthal has never been definitively disproven, and it has never been definitively proven. The evidence is ambiguous in the way that evidence from 60,000 years ago tends to be ambiguous. But consider what the flower, if it was placed deliberately, represents. It represents a being who understood that the person it was placing the flower beside was not coming back, who understood in some form that death is permanent, who felt something in response to that permanence, something that can reasonably be called grief, that motivated them to do something that had no practical function. something that was entirely about the meaning of what had been lost. The flower says, "You mattered. The fact of your existence was not nothing. Your going is not the same as if you had never been. I cannot follow you, but I can mark the place where you stopped. I can put something living on the ground where you lie. I can say, with this gesture, that the world is different now, that something has been taken from it, that it should be noted." That is what the flower says. And if it was placed deliberately, if a Neanderthal hand gathered those flowers 60,000 years ago and laid them in that grave, then the capacity for that knowledge and for that response to it is older than our species. It is something we share with the beings we displaced, the beings we may have helped to extinction, the beings whose DNA, in small portions, we carry in our own genomes as the trace of ancient encounters. The knowledge of death is not what separates us from them. It may be what we shared. The continuity, the trajectory from the pit of bones at Atapuerca 430,000 years ago to the grief you have felt for people you have loved is not broken. It is a single continuous thread. The beings who threw those bodies into that pit were not us. They were not modern humans. They were not even Neanderthals. They were something before both. Something more distant from us than Neanderthals are. Something that left no living descendants that we know of. And they placed those bodies in that pit. And they placed that red hand axe with them. And whatever they understood about what they were doing, they understood enough to do something rather than nothing. To mark the end of a life as different from the continuation of the surrounding world. 430,000 years of the same response. In different languages, in different rituals, in different cosmologies, but the same recognition. The same refusal to treat a death as nothing. That recognition is what you are. It is what every human being who has ever lived, not the specific beliefs about what comes after those have varied enormously across cultures and centuries, and will continue to vary, but the recognition itself, the fact that death is not nothing, that the end of a life matters, that something is owed to it. That is the oldest human thing there is, older than farming, older than language as we know it, older than the species that currently carries it, and it is not going away. The final thought, you will die. You already knew that. You have known it since you were a child, since the cognitive architecture of your prefrontal cortex matured enough to make the temporal projection that places you, at some future point, in the position of the people you have already lost. You have been managing that knowledge your entire life, with work that feels meaningful, with relationships that feel permanent despite everything, with beliefs, or their absence, that provide some framework for the question of what it means, with a particular human ability to mostly not think about it, to keep the knowledge below the surface of daily consciousness, while still letting it, from below, give color and urgency to everything that happens above. The Neanderthal who placed those flowers was doing the same thing, managing the same knowledge, choosing, in the face of it, to do something gentle, something that added rather than took away. You are not alone in this. You are connected, across an unbroken thread of grief and beauty and attempted meaning-making, to every human being, and every near human being who ever stood over a grave and felt the specific weight of knowing that death is real, and that it takes people you cannot afford to lose. That connection does not make death easier. Nothing makes death easier, but it makes it less solitary, less arbitrary, less like a random affliction visited on a specific body at a specific moment. It is the oldest thing we have in common, the knowledge that time runs out, and the question of what to do with what remains. The Neanderthal gathered flowers. The child at El Castillo pressed a hand to stone and breathed pigment around it. The builders of Göbekli Tepe moved mountains to mark a meaning. The woman at Kafse was buried with ochre and shells, surrounded by evidence that she was someone. We are still doing all of it, every day, in 1,000 different forms. We are still, every one of us, deciding what the knowledge of our own mortality means, and what to make of the time we have left. The question of when humans first understood they were going to die turns out to be the question of when we became human. The answer is gradually, over hundreds of thousands of years, in Neanderthal caves and African ochre pits, and Indonesian cave walls and Russian steppe burials, across species boundaries and across the catastrophes that ended whole lineages of beings who felt, in some form, what we feel now. The grief is not new. The flowers are very old. And every act of beauty and care that humans have ever produced is, in some sense, an answer to the same question.